Hey everybody, before we start today's stories, I just want to remind everyone that the Wine Kitchen is offering takeout again tomorrow, Friday, March 27th. Last week I had an assortment of vegetarian options and they were really delicious. So support them again this Friday and have a great day. Here, I'm going to be reading you two Curious George stories today. So the first one is going to be Curious George and the Dump Truck. This is George. He lived with his friend, the man with the yellow hat. He was a good little monkey and always very curious. This morning, George was playing with his toys when he heard a funny noise outside his window. It sounded like a quack. George was curious. What could be quacking underneath his window? It was a duck, of course. Then George heard another quack and another. Why, it was not just one duck. It was a mother duck and 5 small ducklings. Ducklings were something new to George. How funny they were. He watched the ducklings waddle after their mother. Where were they going? George was not curious for long. Soon, he was waddling after Mother Duck too. Now he could see where they were going. The ducks waddled all the way to the park. George loved the park. Today, he saw children flying kites and gardeners planting trees by the pond. Then, George saw something he had never seen in the park before. It was a dump truck, and it was big. In fact, George was not even as tall as one wheel. George forgot all about the ducklings and stopped to look. It would be fun to sit in such a big truck, thought George. No one was inside the truck, and the window was wide open. George could not resist. But sitting in a big truck was not so fun for a little monkey after all. George could not even see out the window. He was too small. If only there was something to climb on. Would this make a good step for a monkey? It did. And now George could see out the window. He saw grass and trees and a family eating a picnic. Suddenly, George heard a low rumbling sound. Was it his stomach rumbling, he wondered? It had been a long time since breakfast. But the rumbling was not coming from George's stomach. It was coming from the back of the truck. George was curious. He climbed out of the window. Then, like only a monkey can, he swung up to the top of the truck. Now he could take a look. He saw the truck was filled with dirt. George was excited. What could be better than a truck full of dirt? George jumped right in the middle of it. Sitting on top of the dirt, George felt the truck bed begin to tilt. It tilted higher and higher. The dirt began to slide. It was sliding right into the pond, and George slid with it. George was having fun, but the pile in the pond got bigger and bigger and bigger, and soon the fun was gone. Just then, the gardeners came back from lunch and stood with their mouths wide open. They saw the empty dump truck, the pile of dirt in the pond, and a very muddy monkey. They knew just what had happened. But before they could say a word, George heard a familiar sound. He heard more quacking. The gardeners heard it too. Then they heard people laughing. "Look," said a girl, "the ducks have their own island." Indeed, they did. The pile of dirt made an island on the pond, and Mother Duck and all her ducklings were waddling right on top. George was sorry he had made such a mess, but the gardeners didn't seem to mind. "We were planting more trees and flowers to make the park nicer for people," said one of the gardeners. "But you've made the park nicer for ducks, too." Later, a small crowd gathered at the pond. "Would you like to help me feed the ducks?" a girl asked George. George was delighted. Soon, everyone was enjoying the park more than ever before, including the ducks, who were the happiest of all in their new home. The end. Before we start our next story, I thought it might be fun to do a little art activity. So grab a pen and a piece of paper if you want to join me. If you want to just watch, that is totally fine too. So seeing as how we just read a story about a dump truck, I thought it might be fun to draw a dump truck. So I'm going to start by drawing a rectangle up at the front. That's pretty good. So remember, a rectangle has two long sides and two short sides. So these are the short sides and those are the long sides. And then I'm just going to draw a little square right on the front of that. So this square has four sides that are all the same length. And then, let's see, I'll draw another rectangle right in the back. So this rectangle looks a little bit different than this rectangle. It's a little bit longer and a little bit more squished. But the important thing is it has two short sides and two long sides. So that makes it a rectangle. And then I'm going to draw another rectangle, but this time the rectangle is going to be a little bit tilted in the back. And that will be my dumper part. And let's see. Oh, it's missing some wheels. I'm going to draw, let's see, I'm going to draw 3 wheels on this side, 2 in the back and one in the front. And the way we can draw these wheels is to draw a big circle with a small circle inside. I'll draw another one back here, big circle with a small circle. And a big circle and a small circle. And let's see, that should be about it. I'm just going to add a few other things to make it look a little bit more like a dump truck. I'll add some headlights in the front. I'll add some little accents to it, a little bumper, maybe a gas tank over here, and a window over here. And I'll add even like a little mirror. Ooh. That'll be my mirror. A little gas cap on the tank. And I'll draw this part that's holding up the dumper part. And then I think a dump truck has this little thing back here. I'll add that on top. And George's dump truck is filled with dirt. So I'm going to make a kind of like a mound of dirt back there. And just add some rectangles here just to give a little bit more texture to the dump truck. All right, looks pretty good. Yeah. That looks like a pretty good dump truck. So I'll go ahead and just color this in. So there we go. I made my dump truck using rectangles, circles, and squares. Enjoy the next story, friends. We're going to read one more story. Curious George Goes Camping. This is George. He was a good little monkey and always very curious. This weekend, George and his friend, the man with the yellow hat, had special plans. They were going camping. At the campsite, the man with the yellow hat unpacked their gear while George looked at all the tents. He saw tents for big families and one just the right size for a puppy. There were even tents on wheels. "Would you like to help me put up our tent, George?" the man asked. George was happy to help. It would not be hard to set up a tent, he thought, but it wasn't easy. "George, why don't you fill our bucket with water at the pump?" his friend suggested. "We'll need it by our campfire later when we roast marshmallows." Marshmallows. George loved marshmallows. He couldn't wait to try them roasted. "Now, don't wander off and get into trouble," the man warned. But George did not hear him. He was already gone. At the pump, George worked the handle up and down. Soon his bucket was full. On the way back down the trail, he saw a family packing up. George watched a girl pour her bucket of water on a campfire. The fire sizzled out. George thought, that looked like fun. He poured his bucket of water on the next campfire. "Hey!" yelled a camper. "We weren't finished with that yet." The camper began to chase George, but George didn't mean to cause trouble. Now he only wanted to hide. He ran into the forest as fast as he could, but the camper's footsteps followed close behind. George ran faster and faster. The footsteps came closer and closer until they were passing George. Why, it was not the camper chasing George now. It was a deer. What fun to run with a deer! Forgetting all about the camper and the marshmallows, George ran after the deer. But a little monkey cannot run as fast as a deer in the woods. Before long, George was lost and all alone. He felt tired and stopped to rest. At first, he was worried. He was very far from camp. But there were lots of other animals to keep him company. He saw a lizard sunning on a rock and a squirrel chattering in a tree. Then he saw the tail of a black and white kitty peeking out from under a bush. He was curious. Would the kitty like to play? George gently pulled the kitty out. But it was not a kitty. It was a skunk, and it was scared. The skunk lifted its tail and sprayed. Psst! Whew! The spray smelled awful. The animals tried to get away. George wanted to get away too, but he could not, and the smell was all over him. How would he ever get rid of this awful smell, he wondered. Too bad he could not take a bath in the woods. Then George had an idea. He could wash the smell off in the creek. George jumped into the cold water. He splashed and scrubbed, but he was still smelly, and now he was wet too. But what could he do? George thought and thought. If he climbed up a tree to dry off, would the smell blow away? No, even dry and high up in a tree, George did not smell better. Poor George! He wished he hadn't wandered so far from camp. He wished he was roasting marshmallows with his friend. Suddenly, George heard footsteps heading toward him. Someone was coming. It was the forest animals, but they ran right past him. They had seen something scary, and George saw it too. It was a fire. George had gotten into trouble for putting out one fire, but this fire wasn't in the campground. This was an emergency. Quickly, George climbed down the tree and grabbed his bucket. He scooped it full of water in the creek. Then, being careful not to spill, he climbed back up and swung from branch to branch through the trees. When George got close enough to the fire, he reached down and poured the water on the flames. Out went the fire with a big hiss. Just then George's friend rushed out of the forest with a ranger. "George," he called, "I was afraid you would be here." "It's a good thing you were here, George," the ranger said. "We saw smoke from the campground, but you put this fire out just in time." George was glad to help, and the man with the yellow hat was glad to see that George was safe. But he had a funny look on his face. "George," he asked, "what is that smell?" Back at the campsite, George's friend helped him get rid of the awful smell. After a strange bath in tomato juice, George smelled fine. Then the man with the yellow hat invited the ranger to cook dinner with him over their own small campfire. "Fires can be nice if you're careful," said the ranger. George agreed, especially for roasting marshmallows. The end. Thanks for reading with me, everybody. Have a great day.